Welcome to Supercool, the show about extraordinary solutions that cut carbon and improve modern life. Each week on Supercool, we go behind the headlines to pinpoint the stories and data accelerating the low-carbon economy in towns and cities across the U.S. and around the globe. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. If you're enjoying the show, please tap the follow or subscribe button on the top of your screen to make sure you get all the episodes. In the fall of 1995, a year out of college, I moved to Nanjing, China. I was hired to teach English to grad students at the Nanjing University of Science and Technology, and a month later I got a part-time job, which eventually became a full-time job, working for Kryptonite Bike Locks, an American company that was setting up manufacturing. I was hired to oversee quality control at the first factory to make sure the locks that were going to be shipped to markets in the US and Europe met the appropriate specifications. The first time I showed up, I went out onto the factory floor with a dozen or so engineers and leaders of the factory to inspect the work. It wasn't that complicated. There were two parts, the U-shaped component and the bar that it fit into. My job was pretty straightforward. Make sure they fit, that the logo is on the correct side of the bar, and then turn the key to make sure it locks. That's it. So I took a U from one bin, I took a bar from another, and then I went to put them together, but they didn't fit. The U was too wide. I tried again. No fit. One more time. Still no fit. As I was surveying the hundreds, if not thousands of locks already in those bins, I could see the Chinese engineers starting to fidget, avoiding eye contact with me, because everyone was about to lose a lot of face, as the saying goes, over this fiasco. Then the head of engineering stepped forward. He grabbed both components from me and tried to insert them together. No luck. But not wasting a moment, he rushed over to a table and started smashing the U-shaped component against it, trying to shrink the gap, narrow it down. He'd bash it, attempt to insert, bash again, attempt to insert. Finally, after multiple smashes, a mangled version of the lock fit together. He turned the key, handed it back to me, then smiled, stepped back, held up his two thumbs, and in English declared, "Okay." Of course, nothing about it was okay. But it was a process, and eventually it got straightened out. For my guest today, Ned Tozun, co-founder and CEO of D.light, his path to building his company that would go on to change the world took him to southern China, to the city of Shenzhen, for 4 years. D.light was founded by two Stanford grad students, Ned and Sam Goldman, in 2007, with a mission to provide safe, affordable, and sustainable energy solutions for all. And for all has meant providing solar-powered products, starting with a solar-powered lamp, to the 2 billion plus people around the world who do not have access to energy. So Ned and Sam raised a small round of capital while at Stanford and then headed out into the world to bring their vision to life. Ned went to China to figure out the supply chain that could produce affordable, durable products, and Sam went to India to get things up and running in the field. 17 years later, D.light is a global phenomenon. Its solar-powered products have touched the lives of over 180 million people in India, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, and a total of 72 countries around the world. The company employs 1,200 people and tens of thousands of local sales agents to bring D.light products into remote rural areas that aren't connected to the grid. 180 million people whose lives have been transformed by D.light. That means kids can study at night thanks to solar-powered lights. Midwives no longer have to help women give birth in the dark. Burning kerosene is replaced with clean solar energy. Today, Ned sees a path to reach 1 billion people by 2030, to transform their lives, to give them an energy grid-like lifestyle without having to connect to the grid. In other words, to leapfrog over legacy fossil fuels and head straight into the low-carbon future. But no battle worth fighting leads to success in a straight line, of victory upon victory. Ned has faced startup adversity and challenges on multiple continents. To realize the company's vision, he's expanded into new fields and functions. Today, D.light is more than a consumer products company. It's also a fintech company, providing payment installment options to its millions of customers to make its renewable energy products more affordable. It's built and expanded in inspiring ways, grounded in company values that it refers to as I Hope, which stands for innovative, honest, optimistic, passionate, and empathetic. Ned was recently named to Time Magazine's Climate 100, its list of the 100 most influential leaders driving business climate action. He has an inspiring story to tell. Here's my conversation with Ned. So there's many things I want to talk to you about today. We're going to get into the playbook behind D.light, and we're going to talk about how you build great products, how you build a great organization, how you finance that organization, how you go do this on a global scale. There's just so much about your story that I find really remarkable. But one of the things I heard you say, or I think recently in an interview I was watching with you, you mentioned that if you go back to the early days of D.light, when you were writing the business plan at Stanford, working on what this is going to be, and you think about where you were at that moment to where you are today, that business plan could have never have imagined the evolution of your company. I'm curious to how you think about that journey is, and maybe use that as an intro just to, in your words, share what D.light does.
It's been 17 years since we started D.light, and when we started out, we really were just set out to eliminate kerosene lanterns for people without access to electricity. In fact, the company was inspired by my business partner when he was living in Benin in West Africa, and his neighbor's son was burned in a kerosene accident. So the kerosene lantern tipped over, and this boy was totally burned. Ended up surviving, but took months to recover. And Sam had this experience and realized that this makes no sense. It's the 21st century. Surely there are better solutions out there. And then he and I connected at Stanford and started the company. And very much at the beginning, we were just focused on how do we make a great product? Because we just believed people were spending so much money on kerosene, this horrible source of lighting. And yet there was technology with solar and LEDs that could make that stuff obsolete for a better price. So we thought naively, make a great product at the right price and it will sell millions and make a huge impact. So we were very much really just a product company focused on this one need. And there were 1.5 billion people who were still using kerosene lanterns at the time that we started out as our primary source of light. And what we really couldn't have imagined when we started out, this where the journey has taken us, because we did create a whole line of products to replace kerosene lamps and have those scaled up massively. That had in a different way than we imagined in some ways, and I can talk about that. But when we started out, I would say as a great product business, and that's who we thought we would be. And we still are a product business, but we ended up having to build last mile distribution, so we became a distribution company into deep rural areas across India and Africa. And I didn't know a thing about route to market and sales teams. And we had to innovate on that 10 times more than the products. And then even kind of the bigger challenge we had to take on was building a consumer finance company, because essentially our product line didn't just stay as solar lanterns. We still sell those and replace kerosene wherever we go. But ultimately, when customers get access to solar, they get a taste of what it can do. They want more. They essentially want to leapfrog the grid and have access to all the things we get access to in having electricity. So we ended up developing solar home systems, even the energy efficient appliances that go along with those. But to make those actually affordable to the families we're trying to reach, we had to spread those payments out in very small amounts over time. So they were paying 30 cents a day or 40 cents a day instead of paying a couple $100s up front, because our customers just can't afford that. So we essentially had to build a fintech consumer finance business, which is even an order of magnitude more complicated than the other things. So we could not have imagined that when we started out. We just thought, build a great product and it will achieve great scale. And there was some naivete in that, but I'm glad we didn't realize how much we were taking on when we started, or nobody probably would have funded us and we may not have actually gotten started.
There's a million ways to take this conversation, but just as you're speaking, I'm reminded of a quote I heard from Ben and Jerry. One of them, they were on How I Built This, talking about building Ben and Jerry's, and they were asked, so was this an incredible experience for you guys? Or how would you describe this experience? You must have been so happy. Everybody loves your ice cream. And one of them said, I wouldn't describe it that way. I wouldn't describe it as happy. He's like, I felt the whole time like we were falling off a cliff, and I was just trying to grab onto anything that would break my fall. And he's like, and so what that felt like for me was like peak experience, as alive as I've ever been, but I would not describe it as a happy experience. You know,
I love that. That resonates strongly with me.
just knowing, as we'll talk about a little bit, I'm sure, as we go, but kind of the ups and downs. Man, I mean, you're one of the few really that's went from startup founder and able to kind of go through all the management scale ups and stay with the company and grow with the company. I know there's been peaks and valleys there to where you are today as you continue to be the CEO, which is amazing. But when I think back, because I knew your first product, everyone in America who was paying attention to sustainability, eco-friendly living 17, 18 years ago, like, we knew your product. And at the time I had this radio show, The Lazy Environmentalist, we were on Sirius, and I think I had like that first little
I love it.
or lamp.
Yes.
And you could hang them. I mean, it's still largely the same product. And I think what was so interesting to me was everyone that I knew, or like I had that thing, because there was just nothing, period, consumer facing that actually was integrating solar in the States or anywhere else. Very, very few products. And certainly at the price point that even when you guys came out, that you were offering that. What's interesting to me about D.light and your journey is like, okay, there's that moment. And people are like, oh, this is really interesting. Maybe I could take this camping. But meanwhile, you guys are like, no, we're going after 2 billion people living in energy poverty, or a billion, put the number really well. There's 1.3 billion on the continent of Africa. Half of them, 650 million, are still off the grid. That's where we're going, right? And so then you have that moment of sustainability kind of fades with the Great Recession and kind of media attention. And it's like things hibernate a little bit, at least in terms of media focus. And yet you guys go off and you're like, okay, now we're actually going to go build this thing. And it's almost like, we'll see you in 15 years when the world comes back and starts shining, looking at us again. Is that how you see it?
It's true. What's interesting is in those early days, I feel like we did get so much press and attention. And I felt very uncomfortable about it, to be honest. I mean, it was helpful for the business. So in that sense, it was good. But I feel like we were almost like heralded as this leader when we hadn't actually achieved the impact yet. And that made me feel very self-conscious. And then ironically, as we started to get to a lot of scale, then we sort of fell off the radar of, media. So it was this weird inversion that happened. But we got a lot of attention, certainly in the early days. And I think that in a way created even more pressure because we were seen as leaders in social enterprises. We were often lifted up as this case study of a social enterprise that worked, but we still weren't profitable. We hadn't actually figured things out, but that's how we were talked about. So there was a sense of, man, if we fail, we're going to not just blow it for our customers and for ourselves, but there's going to be like sector-wide impacts for impact-related funding. Maybe that gets less hot if we go under, and then just for energy access in general. So we really felt a lot of pressure to make it work. In order to do that, we essentially had to reinvent ourselves multiple times along the way. So it had several near-death experiences as a company, but we're able to manage through. So it's been an interesting adventure. It's also just interesting to reflect on that media attention piece where sometimes the attention comes where it's not deserved all the time, but there's certain trends that you ride on.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't mean to belabor it, but I do remember that moment. And it used to drive me nuts. And it's probably also something was ingrained in me. And I maybe subconsciously where I was always, destined to do something like Supercool. Because I remember General Motors getting so much, attention for, I think it was the Chevy Volt. That was still like 3 or 4 years away from even coming to market. And Bob Lutz is out and everyone's talking and writing about it. And I was just like, what are y'all writing about? You can't buy it. But it was such a hype moment right after Al Gore's movie. It was a different moment. But to bring it back to D.light, what I'd like to do is run through some of the different key aspects of your business. And I know you have a very interesting take, you've always have from the beginning, on human-centered design, the way you develop the product right out of the gate.
It was core to our DNA, and we started out actually at the Stanford Design School. There was this class called Design for Extreme Affordability, which is where D.light came out of. And we were lucky enough to have professors and mentors who were connected with IDEO. The founder of IDEO was one of the mentors for the class. So really just got infused with this kind of human-centered design thinking and principles. And I think that allowed us to get some really great insights from people who are using kerosene and what they really need. And I think there's a sense, because if you're working at Apple or somewhere like that, you are also the customer of these products. So there's like an intuition you can use when designing the products of what would be cool. But in our case, we're not living in a village without electricity. So we really have to go in with a mindset of wanting to learn and being open. And we would essentially co-develop these products with our customers. We take various prototypes into the field, see how they would use them, see which one they would gravitate more towards, which form factors, which design, even things like color temperature of the lights. We preferred a more yellowish like light, but our customers really liked the bluish light. And for them, yellow was more like kerosene. It didn't feel modern. And blue, which to us seemed a little like harsher, more like fluorescent lighting, that kind of thing. Our customers in the villages, they loved it because it seemed modern, like high tech.
I'm sorry, when you say in the villages, where were you doing this testing? Were you, like, which continent were you on?
Oh, yeah.
Which countries were you in?
Initially, at the very beginning, we were in Myanmar, of all places, because the design school had a connection with an organization that worked in Myanmar. So we did a lot of our early field research there. And then once we got a little bit of funding and started out, we shifted to India. So Sam moved to India, I moved to China. That was how we kind of divvied things up. And he was trying to figure out how do we sell these things and sell these products. And I was figuring out how do we make them. So we focused mostly in Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, those are like kind of states in northern India, where at the time electrification was very low. And we would go out into some of these remote villages that were totally off grid. We'd sometimes spend the night there. So at the beginning, we had a few weeks where we would just go from place to place, taking various prototypes with the engineers, sleeping over in these villages. It was an amazing experience.
Okay, hold on. So that experience, yeah, I don't want to rush past that. Like, so you guys, have you graduated at this point? Or?
Yeah. So the Myanmar trips were when we were at Stanford. We raised little bits of money from pockets of Stanford for these trips. So we would do those trips that way. Actually, we did in our second year of business school, we did our Christmas vacation. It was like 3 weeks, and Sam and I just went off to Myanmar and were out there in the rural areas doing testing.
So let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
How do you do that? Like, how do you show up in a village? Oh, I guess IDEO, you had some connections. Do you have a guide?
Yeah, we didn't just show up. So Sam, he's an interesting guy. He's an American, but grew up in different parts of the world because his parents were in development. So he did his high school years in India. So it wasn't a totally foreign place. He had a lot of connections there. We had a lot of classmates actually who were from India who were connecting us to various organizations. So we got connected with a few different nonprofit organizations that worked in these communities. And then we got translators from those organizations. And essentially we work with them to identify the villages. And then we just have a translator coming around with us and we would speak to people that way.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah, I can only imagine kind of being like in the early days and all the excitement and just the learning that just must be coming at you so fast.
The vertical learning curve, definitely. We would constantly be learning things, both on the design of the products, but also how to make them robust. And I think that was so key. It wasn't just about the functionality and the look and form, but the reality is these villages, and they're pretty harsh environments. It can be hot, really dusty. We found, like in this one village we took these prototypes to, there were these certain kinds of bugs that were able to get into like these vents in the product and would essentially fill the whole, front plate of the product with bugs and obscure the light. So we had to put this mesh in terms on the vents and things like that. So we did a lot to design the products to actually work reliably in these conditions. And we were able to figure out how to do it in affordable ways. And that's, I guess, the other side of the coin. And the reason why I was in China is we realized the human-centered design insights were good, important, but not sufficient. We also needed the supply chain insights. And you can make actually a great quality product that's robust without the supply chain insights, but it's going to be really expensive. And if you want to actually make it affordable, you have to understand the supply chain. So things like the LEDs initially, how are they binned in color temperature? What are the more affordable bins? What are the ones that we can get better deals on? For solar panels, how do they cut them? What are the size of the cells that they get? All these kinds of things we would try to deep dive with all the suppliers and understand how do we really optimize performance for things like on the plastic side. Really, we had this amazing co-founder, mechanical engineer. His name's Xianyi Wu. And he did all of our initial mechanical design. And he made these amazing ribs in the plastic that kind of were shock absorbers that didn't add a lot of cost, but it made it so when you drop the product, it just would not break. They were really sturdy products. So when we went out initially marketing the products, actually, when we had our first products come out, we could drop them and they would keep working. So that was a way we could explain quality. We had the cycle life of the batteries, all kinds of crazy stuff we would do to really make them work. But what would really communicate quality to our customers is we would take it in the demonstration from 2 meters, 3 meters, drop it, it would crash onto the ground and the concrete, they'd pick it up, it would still work. Everyone would be like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. So that was the way we would communicate quality in those early days. But of course we have to be backed by all those other things that actually make the product work for a long time. And typically in these villages, customers that we work with, the other products they would get, they were just junk. So when you actually delivered a product at a good price that actually lasted and was good value for money, you built incredible brand loyalty. So just a huge focus on great design for the products, the affordability and quality, and marrying the human-centered design insights with the supply chain insights. I lived in China almost 4 years setting that all up, and it really, that's what it took at the beginning to really crack that.
Yeah, I for sure, and we'll link to it. So I was on Amazon, and there's a video where it starts, it's quiet, you see a house, and then this thing comes flying out of like a second or third story window, and it was like so loud that it actually like woke my dogs up, and they started like howling. So and then of course you come out, you turn it on, and so it's a great piece. If anyone folks can find it on Amazon, we'll link to it in the show notes. Okay, so you're really designing for the use case of this design of this customer who is rural, developing countries, just a very, very different. And one thing I heard you say, you had to design in case a cow might walk over it. I mean, the whole use case is fascinating. And then you do something that very few people would even think to do, are willing to do. You say, I'm going to go uproot. I'm going to go live in China for as long as it takes to get the supply chain going. You go to Shenzhen. Mm-hmm. I was in Shenzhen a decade before you and working on some manufacturing there. It probably had progressed a fair amount by the time you got there. But the thing that I felt about China that I loved, that was so peak for me when I went, was that there was very little to ground me in like the sort of West. You go to Europe and you're like, okay, yeah, this is kind of like this place, and where this croissant tastes like my bakery back home. But like, go to China, right? And you're just like,
it's different.
So yeah, tell me a little bit about that. So you set up in Shenzhen. What was that experience like?
It was wild. And to make it even kind of up the stakes even more, I just gotten married. So right before going to business school. So my wife and I relocated. So she plays a big role in this story too, because she was willing to uproot her career and go on this adventure with me in those early days. She was doing marketing and HR and all. So it was very much like a family thing these first couple of years. And initially, like, we didn't have a bank account or a company set up in China. So the only way to pay rent, we had an apartment basically that we used to live in, but also we had an office in the middle, or like office, workspace in the middle. We could work. It was just, everything was covered with prototypes and batteries and all kinds of stuff. And to pay for anything, we just have to go to the ATM machine, like get all the stack of, the local bills, pay things in cash. And sometimes we would have to, it was a limit on how much you could withdraw each day. Sometimes I would go to the ATM at like around midnight. So I could do one withdrawal at 11:55 p.m., another one at 12:05. So I could have enough to pay our rent or whatever it was. Just took months to get like bank accounts set up at that time. And I remember we interviewed our first person in China, and she comes out to this apartment. What the hell have I got myself into? She ended up joining and, was with us for more than 10 years. And I think at the beginning, it was really about finding that right kind of core team of people who understood the China landscape, could help us navigate, people who were trustworthy. Those first hires were so important. One of our first hires was someone in HR that I feel like helped bridge that cultural divide. And there's many moments where he said, yeah, what you just said, this is how it's going to be interpreted in the Chinese context. I was like, oh, I had no idea. So there's a lot of those lost in translation type of issues, but that's where it was about hiring that core team. And then Sam, it was a bit similar experience for him in India, getting people who could really understand both cultures and help bridge that divide, while also trying to create an overall D.light culture. So I think that was something at the beginning we had to figure out how to navigate. It's like, is a D.light, the D.light culture that we want to create? And then what are those local aspects of culture that we should embrace and accept the differences?
Yeah. What strikes me just hearing you talk about the first number of years of the business is that you're not just, every startup founder, when you're trying to build something that scales, you are living the business, right? But even still, if you're doing it in the States, right, you still can get some break in a certain sense, right? Like you're still, okay, if I'm 12 hours at the office, whatever it is, like I still go home, right? But you and Sam, you have lived your business certainly in different moments, but for a long time in those years, in a different way, right? And I know the mission is so strong in both of you, and you've talked about that. You've talked about the fact that, yes, you were growing a company, but you were so focused on the mission, there came this point when then you realized, oh, right, to like fulfill the mission, we really have to build the organization. We can't be doing everything or that will slow us down. And you had this really interesting way to talk about that. And maybe this is a good kind of segue to talk about growing the company. But you had talked about flying at the right altitude. I really love this. So as the CEO and the executives, where you're hands off enough to see the big picture, guide the company, and you're empowering your team to do the work. And if you swoop down and you fly too low, then you still have to find that balance that enables the organization to flourish. Like, those are really interesting ideas I heard you talking about. So I'd love to hear more about that, and then how you kind of transition to saying, hey, we got a global thing here. We got to put the infrastructure in place, and we got to really figure out what it means to build a global company.
Yeah, and I think that flying at the right altitude analogy is a helpful one even now for us to think about, because I think as a leader of an organization, there's just sometimes in a crisis moment, sometimes you do have to lower the altitude, get closer to the details, or deep dive in a certain area. And I think being a founder and having you build everything from the ground up, you're able to do that. But I think a lot of times what founders can do is they get stuck in that mode, and then the organization struggles to scale, because if the founder is always stuck in all the details of everything, eventually you burn out, or you get overstretched. You can't do it as the organization gets to a certain level. So I think what were able to do over time, and I think it was definitely a learning process. I mean, we didn't do it all right. At the beginning, Sam and I were doing way too much and really nearly burned ourselves out, probably multiple times. It was so intense. And as you say, we were living this every day in and out, but every little problem gets surfaced to us. And it just seemed like we had a team that was working really hard and doing a lot, but wasn't necessarily able to take problems, manage them, and come up with solutions. It was sort of problems would all just get escalated to us. And part of that was also, we enabled that to a degree because we encouraged people to let us know the problems, and didn't necessarily encourage people to come up with solutions proactively. So these are things we learned over time. But what really helped as the organization grew, hiring the right leaders with different functional expertise. And I think there also we've learned, just getting someone with functional expertise doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be sharing your values, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be that innovative. Because sometimes people who've been doing the same thing for 20 or 30 years, they're very stuck in their ways. But as an innovative company, we can't necessarily do everything like it's been done in the past. On the flip side, you don't want to throw out practices because maybe 80% of them can work and 20% need to be tweaked. So I think finding people with that right combination of experience, but also the entrepreneurialism on them, that they have some of that drive and ability to innovate, and not being too stuck in their ways. Those are things we learned how to filter for. And in fact, we developed this criteria. We call it the I hope values. And that's a screen we use when hiring anybody, but especially senior talent. So I hope stands for innovation, honesty, optimism, passion, and empathy. And there's ways we can kind of screen for those characteristics. And we find that if people have those innate characteristics and then they have their experience in their functional area, then you get someone who's really great and that we can then empower and delegate things to, and then we're not managing every detail, but then having enough visibility with dashboards and things to make sure things don't get too off. So I think we've had to learn over time how to fly at the right altitude, have the right metrics and the dashboard so we can understand how the health of the plane is and not be surprised. And yeah, to be able to deep dive. I mean, I still do skip level reviews, for example, having a chance to chat with people, like the frontline salespeople. I'll go out to the field and talk with people to get a pulse of what's going on, and then feed that back to the team and the leadership. It's been a constant sort of learning. And as the organization goes through different stages, you just have to adapt your leadership style and fly at those different altitudes of what the company needs.
Well, let me contextualize that for a second. So that all makes sense to me, what you're saying. The last count I heard, because it's going up with every interview you give, that you've reached now about 180 million people around the world.
Yep.
Who are impacted by D.light products, the solar home systems now, and that product line keeps expanding. What it means, people keep going up the energy rung ladder, renewable energy rung ladder, as you call it. In some sense, it's like you're almost building your own global utility in a way, mm-hmm. right? And we're going to talk about the concept of leapfrogging, the fossil fuel grid, and remarkable stuff. But to place some contextualization on what you're saying, Ned, this is happening in an international context. So when you say you're going to go hire the right people, you're going to go hire the right people in India. You're going to go hire the right people in Tanzania, in multiple countries in Africa. You're going to put people on the ground. You're going to train them up. And so maybe talk for a minute, if you would, about what it means to build the D.light culture and then still kind of have it resonate and contextualize for different subcultures, national cultures, and then probably more microcultures within a country itself, right? Where maybe places are very different from each other in ways of doing business and norms. And what strikes me, and the reason why I'm asking, is because, I mean, if I think about it long enough, I'll probably come up with something. But like all the places where your product exists today in the world, and I've heard you say, and I've actually heard others say, hey, go to sub-Saharan Africa, go out to like the rural countryside. You're going to see D.light products. Like, you're going to see it everywhere. You're going to see people in your, like, wearing your polo shirts or whatever who are D.light employees, right? But I can't really think of a company that's, let's say, in its second decade that has gone with a product, a consumer product, as global, as fast as D.light has. Like, you could say, well, Nest thermostat. And I'd be like, I doubt it. I doubt they have 180 million customers or families impacted by their product. In some senses, you might be the largest home solar company in the world. I suspect that's probably the case. And so I just don't want to lose sight of like the context that you're talking about. Putting this sort of infrastructure in place is really remarkable.
All I can say is it's taken a lot of iteration to get there. After living in China, I lived in East Africa for quite a while and spent time making sure we had the right team, the right culture. And Kenya was our first kind of African hub. And then from there, we expanded into Uganda and Tanzania, which are bordering Kenya. So it was easy to kind of hop to each of those places and ensure we had a consistent culture. And then in Nigeria. And I think over time, as we got bigger and got better at recruiting and screening for people, we learned how to do that screening. So I think we did churn through talent a lot as we were building things out. When I think about our initial team in Kenya, and we had some great people, but the turnover rate was probably close to 100% the first couple of years, which I'm not proud of. But it just took a while to really figure out like what is the profile of person that's going to be successful at D.light to resonate with our culture. And as you say, also respect like the local cultural differences and embrace those too. So I think part of it was like having that clear definition. And we do a lot to reinforce our values and who we are, like what our culture is. What is the D.light culture and the D.light way? We have a lot of award programs, for example, for people who embrace like the D.light values. So we do a lot to try to remind people of that. But a lot of it really is in the recruiting and who you're bringing into the organization. Because a lot of this stuff really is just in people's DNA, regardless of what culture they come from. Whether you're hiring an American or Kenyan, it almost doesn't matter. Like some people are just more naturally innovative in how they are, and some people aren't, or empathetic. You know, these are some, it can be learned to a degree, but there's some amount that if you don't have it at all, it's very hard to cultivate it.
That's actually great to hear, because I think for a lot of people, you know, lots of founders there's so much training and emphasis on that, right? Like really understand your core values, communicate it over and over and over and over again. Awards, other ways. How do you reinforce it constantly? How do you support the right behaviors that you want to see? Highlight those behaviors, elevate those behaviors so people really get it. And of course, that's having that I hope, innovation, honest, optimistic, passionate, empathetic as a screen for hiring managers. I'm just like, all that takes time. And I just find it like, but you guys are growing, you know, so now 180 million homes. You had to figure out financing, you had to figure out all this stuff to get this next 60 million. You're trying to get to 1 billion. But you're doing this all on the rocket ship, right? It's not like, okay, we're growing 10% year over year. We got some time to put systems in place. It's like, trying to put systems in, right? As you're like, right? Like,
and well, so, asteroids are being hurled at us and laser beams and all kinds of stuff. So that's right.
All right, let's talk about, there seemed to be, I'm guessing you probably had the awareness at some point relatively early on in the journey that you're trying to make your products as affordable as possible, yet affordability is still a huge hurdle to try and bring your products into these rural, developing countries. And so you come up with this idea of saying, how can we come up with some creative financing, your pay-as-you-go model or pay-go? Can you talk about that and how that's evolved and where it is today and what that's unlocking for you?
Within a couple of years, we realized that once people got access to solar lanterns, they wanted more. And with the technology that was becoming available, as solar costs were coming down, as battery storage is getting better and better, it was increasingly possible to provide solar home system solutions. And eventually, we saw a future where people could leapfrog the grid, similar to how Mobile phones totally skipped landlines in a lot of the places we work. We saw these solar solutions frogging the grid because the reality for many of our customers is the grid is just not going to get there in the next decade. But solar is affordable, but the way to make it work is to finance it, because if these customers, they cannot afford to pay for their energy all up front. But if the payment is spread over time, over a year or 2 years or 3 years, then all of a sudden it becomes affordable. So then the question is, how do you finance to customers? And initially, we did not want to do this. We really wanted to find banks or microfinance organizations that could do this for us. And in fact, in India, where you have the microfinance ecosystem really well built out, we started working through the microfinance orgs, and that worked really well. We started doing that really within a couple years of us starting out. And we could see the demand would go up 10x or 20x when you had financing available. And it just became clear that was the route to make this work. But unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically initially in Kenya, where we were starting out, there were some microfinance organizations there, but they just, weren't willing to finance the customers we were serving because they had absolutely no credit history, and B, weren't at the same level of scale at all as the microfinance organizations in India. But what you had in many of these sub-Saharan African countries was a robust ecosystem of mobile money. So basically, mobile money is when you can pay digitally. And in Kenya, everyone was on M-Pesa. It's just amazing how much, you go to the most remote village, people would have at least like a dumb feature phone and the ability to send money with M-Pesa. And this was a trend taking off across a lot of countries in Africa. So that infrastructure was there. And we started testing out, I think it was like in 2009 or 2010, some early prototypes of, can we actually remotely switch the product off and on based on if the customer has made a payment via mobile money, and just enable the customer to pay for these products at 20 cents or 30 cents or 40 cents a day, depending on the product. And we found that it could work. So we basically started out, we initially were partnering with an organization that was essentially doing the finance side, and then ended up going our separate ways with them and realized we had to do it all ourselves. So we built the back end and started integrating this into our solar home systems. Started out in one county in Kenya, and we had several investors who thought we were totally nuts for doing this. They said, you're a product company, this fintech is totally different. But we really felt the product side was going to be commoditized in the long run. And really the value was going to be in the company that actually reached the end customer. And we had already started building last mile distribution, which I can talk about separately. That's another kind of fun, important component of this, because we actually have to reach the customer directly. But then the finance side means we have to continue to engage with them. What I like about the pay-as-you-go model is it aligns our interest in the customers totally, because if the product fails, they don't pay. So, we're always committed to quality, but this kind of ratchets it up even more, where you have to deliver a good quality product that's providing consistent utility for the customer, or they will not pay you. So this sort of just causes us to double down and making the product even better, having then this back-end system. And then we have to develop all kinds of credit infrastructure and policy for, these are unbanked customers, but there are ways you can create incentives and structure in your sales team and / loan officers, essentially, to figure out what's the right product to sell to this customer. Is this customer going to be reliably paying over time? How do I ensure this customer is taken care of once the product's delivered to them if they have a problem? And then having call centers and things in these markets to continue to engage with the customer, after sales centers, so they can easily and quickly get them service. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be set up around this to make it work. And then plus the integration with all the different mobile money providers, working with our backend. Now D.light is one of the very top drivers of M-Pesa traffic in Kenya, as well as other mobile money traffic, because there's just so many transactions that go through our system. We can get 10 or 20 transactions per second sometimes in Kenya, which is insane to me. But you have a lot of these microtransactions happening. But fundamentally, this enables people to pay in small amounts every day that they can work with their cash flow. And at the end, they can then own the system, because once it's paid off, it's unlocked permanently. And now they have light, they have power, and they can, instead of paying utility forever, they can actually own their own power and then invest their cash flows in other things that can improve their lives. So I think, and what's been fun to see is we've seen a lot of customers who are actually grid connected, but the grid is unreliable, choosing to go to like the off-grid solar solution or distributed solution because they don't trust the utility and they want to own their own power. And we're seeing people even in the US and Europe do this. So I feel like this model is a way that a lot of sub-Saharan Africa is leading the way and what the future may look like. Just like I think they led the way with mobile phones, mobile money. They adopted these kinds of technologies even faster than we did here in the US or in Europe because they didn't have this existing legacy infrastructure. So they could just jump right to the future much more quickly, which I think is pretty cool.
Oh, I love it. I think it's certainly in our lens, yeah, it's like the height of super coolness. But like you said, they didn't have that legacy infrastructure, mobile payments, because there's no finance system.
They weren't
really
banked.
reliable,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Weren't banked. So you have these mobile technologies, and now every time I hear you talk about it, I get chills thinking about like the continent of Africa leapfrogging fossil fuels to this renewable future. But it is in a sense like you build that technology, you build this fintech platform, you figure out how to integrate it, you set up call centers, you put all this infrastructure in place, you build the hardware. Like you guys have verticalized so much to be able to deliver the impact and the mission that you set out, in the beginning. You got to go through all of this stuff to keep delivering the impact. When I think about D.light, and I know you want to go from 180 million lives touched, lives impacted to 1 billion by 2030, massive growth ahead of you. When you're in a home, right, when you land, and then even if it's someone starting with a lamp, right, and they're getting rid of kerosene and all the health impacts and what that does to improve their lives, right, and then they upgrade to the next maybe kit from D.light, and they've got something a little more advanced, or they start somewhere higher up. But you're in a position with those customers to continue to level them up the ladder of energy, right? So they're getting
exactly.
And I heard you, it's your words, but I'm going to repeat it. You said giving them like a grid-like experience without being connected to the grid. But in that sense, do you think of yourselves like the utility? I mean, is that like a mental model that you have?
Yeah, in some ways we are like utility. And I think where we're not is, we don't want to just continue to extract money from our customers just for energy. We want them to own the product. So I think we do think of ourselves fundamentally as a company that's delivering transformative products. And once they have their home system, I don't want to keep collecting money from them from that home system. I want to sell them a refrigerator or a TV or something else on finance. So in that sense, we're for a bigger system so they can power more things and improve their lives. So our mission is to transform lives with sustainable products. That's how we think of what we do. So in that sense, we're not like utility. They are their own utility. I think there was an initial sort of debate within other players that were starting to come up in this space and figuring out how to serve these customers, the utility model, or I would say like the maybe energy as a service model versus the lease to own model. And we actually tested this out with customers because with, like an energy as a service model, in theory, you could charge a little bit less per day, but then you just charge them forever and then you continue to service these systems. But we found there was a really high desire among our customers to own their own energy. They really wanted to have that independence and were willing to pay a little bit more so they could pay for a certain period of time and then they would own it. It was theirs, and something that I respect with our customers, and that I think the market has spoken and the customers have spoken that is the model that they want. And I think that's a beautiful thing if they can own their own power.
Absolutely. So just to dig into some metrics for a minute, what kind of, what's the success rate, let's say, for pay-as-you-go, or however you define that metric?
So default rate is a kind of key thing to look at, like how many people end up actually completing their payments. Because you have some people who complete it, but they might complete it a little late. Maybe they miss some payments, they don't have power those days, but then they keep paying and then they own it. So there, it's in the range of 5 to 10% is the default rate. I'd like it to be even lower, but is a pretty good rate compared to other companies doing, like, let's say, consumer finance to unbanked customers. Typically, they have a much higher default rate. And I think that is really tied to the value that we're delivering to the customer at the end of the day. We want to get that default rate down as low as we can. In Nigeria, it's around 5%, which is our lowest kind of default rate market. And I think some of these other countries, some of the reason why it might be a little higher is there have been other companies that have come up in this space, and then they'll try to sell the customer another system. And so they might have multiple systems in their home. But at the end of the day, a lot of these people are still getting access to energy. And then some might have a shock, financially, where the harvest has failed, or they've had a death in the family. They no longer can afford to make those payments. In those cases, we try to have some workout arrangement with them where they can pay over a longer period of time at a lower daily rate, but can't always sort those things out. That's the kind of success metric we look at.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you call it the default rate. We could call it the 90 to 95% success rate, trying to get, that is that right? Yeah. Okay. In terms of impact and what you measure, KPIs beyond the finance metrics, but in terms of impact, I'd love to hear you talk about how you think about carbon reduction.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to also hear how you think about measuring impact in people's lives, like what that means and what you're evaluating from a D.light perspective.
Yeah. So in terms of the carbon side, there's various different sort of methodologies around for these solar home systems. And we've even gotten into some clean cooking solutions for families, and those have massive carbon offsets. But there you have to look at what on average are these customers using for their source, let's say, of lighting or cooking. And that will vary depending on the country, sometimes even within the country. And then where are they moving to? And they're moving to a purely solar solution, and they're not using any kerosene anymore, which is typically the case. Let's say with a solar home system, the kerosene lantern use will go to zero essentially. And then you measure the difference of like, what is the impact of how much carbon are you actually abating or offsetting? We have, like I said, different methodologies across different countries where we measure this stuff and try to use kind of an industry harmonized standard around this. And based on that, we've so far offset a cumulative total of close to 40 million tons of CO2, which is about the annual emissions of Norway, which I think is like a pretty good start. But yeah, I think as we get into sort of bigger systems, and we have some new products that have come out in the last year that are solar inverter solutions that are really designed to replace the diesel generator. And you hear these in sub-Saharan Africa all the time, or in Nigeria especially. There are so many diesel generators running. If even in Lagos, you go around, you'll hear these just running constantly, and they're belching out the diesel smoke. It's nasty stuff. And we want to have solutions that can replace that. And there you'll get pretty significant carbon abatement for those kinds of products that are replacing diesel generators, much more so than replacing kerosene lanterns. And a bit similar with the cooking, because right now most of our customers essentially cook with an open flame and just burn firewood or charcoal. And with clean solar solutions or solar powered cooking solutions, there you'll also have huge amounts of carbon offset. It could be like multiple tons per year per product as the product's in use. So I expect by 2030, we'll get to around 100 million tons offset. And then I'd love to see us get to a place where we're offsetting about a country's worth of emissions every year across our customer base, like Kenya or Tanzania. It'd be cool to be as just a single company offsetting a country's worth of emissions. And then in terms of the impact side, the main metric that you referred to is like how many lives are we touching? So we've reached 180 million now. And roughly for every product we sell, there's about 5 people in the household that are using that product. So we're at around 35 million total products sold. There's some discounts we have on the 5 or to account for multiple products in the same house. So it counts about 180 million people in the world are using our products today and are somehow impacted by them. And then we also look at things like how much money are we saving our customers from buying kerosene or let's say diesel. And that's like billions of dollars essentially per year we're saving our customers. It's pretty amazing. And then the other one we look at is how many school children are using our products. That's something, inspired the company. It was from a kid who was burned by kerosene. And we're now over 70 million kids are using our products today, which is something that makes us all feel proud and excited. So those are the kinds of things we look at. There's other things there's so many impacts with our products in terms of like health impacts. It's very hard to actually concretely measure those, I guess like a scientifically accurate way. But we know anecdotally there's a lot of health impacts, like kids who like had asthma because breathing in these fumes, all of a sudden their health is improved. There's less burns, less fires created by kerosene, all those sorts of things. So I'm sure D.light has, saved thousands of lives from kerosene fires because there's so many of these accidents that happen, but it's very hard to actually quantify those. But those are things we talk about, but it's hard to measure specifically.
Where I sit today, or just in the States, to understand the impact beyond the numbers, right? You can see lots of stories that, you guys have done a great job with filming and bringing the D.light mission to life, but man, when you see someone say, a woman who's a midwife and she's helping mothers give birth in the dark, and suddenly
Yep.
she has, and it's so hard to put yourself in that situation and understand the transformational impact that D.light is having on the world. And to bring it back to where we started this conversation, there was this moment 15 or so years ago when there really was this huge media spotlight on all this stuff, how the world was going to change. And I really do think An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's movie, his platform, I think really did suddenly kind of open this opportunity for the media to tell stories. And the media wants to tell stories. At least back then, it was like, well, how are we going to go tell the story of sustainability? Let's go look at products because that's something we know how to do.
Yeah.
And, right. And then it's like, it's not like we were in the wilderness. I mean, so much, the world has advanced in many, many exciting ways on clean technologies, but now there's a renewed focus, it seems, on D.light. You're in the Time magazine, the Climate 100, you were just recognized with the Earthshot Prize. And it's like the world is coming back around being like, holy moly, these guys have been out there in the world affecting change on scale and magnitude. I suspect it will continue because it's so real. The impacts are so utterly real. What you've been able to accomplish.
Yeah, and it really feels like there's this certain inflection point that we're hitting. We've had these kind of multiple inflection points along the journey. So I guess I have enough perspective over 17 years to see when they're coming. And, sometimes you just have to slog through and survive. There are those periods like during COVID, or there's a period where the currencies all like massively devalued in Africa. It was just a hard time for a lot of businesses. But I'm really seeing right now is a moment where there is a lot more awareness of these kinds of solutions. We're seeing significant support now coming in from like the World Bank to help accelerate the market. And so there's some really exciting programs that are launching in several countries that are going to enable us to essentially subsidize the price of the product and open up the market to many more people who couldn't otherwise access it. And we're seeing that coming down the pipeline the next year. And just generally, like, these products are just getting more and more affordable. There's more and more things we can do with appliances, with customers. So I'm really seeing this is a time, the next few years, where there's going to be a lot of growth, a lot more impact. And I'm kind of wired as an entrepreneur. I think 17 years ago, it would have been hard for me to imagine doing the same thing. But honestly, it just always feels new. And just feels like the start of a really exciting chapter for D.light and just for kind of renewable energy as a whole for the markets we work in. I think it's going to be a really exciting time for transforming a lot of lives. So we're excited to play a role in it.
Ned, thank you so much for joining us today. It was just great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. Thank you, Josh.